This is a private community. Carter Whitaker, a white HOA board member, spits the words at Dr. Elena Marlo, demanding ID as she tries to relax by her own pool. He doesn't see a neighbor, he sees a black woman trespassing. Fueled by racial bias, his aggression escalates while neighbors film silently. What Carter doesn't know? He's menacing Austin's first black police chief. Elena calmly holds her ground, withholding her badge, letting his prejudice unravel him. This viral poolside confrontation ignites a firestorm, exposing deep systemic rot and forcing a choice between a broken system and real justice. See the moment power dynamics flip. Watch now. The late afternoon sun hung low over the manicured lawns of Willow Creek Estates, casting elongated shadows across the gated community's centerpiece, a pristine aquamarine pool surrounded by loungers and umbrellas. The air carried the faint hum of cicadas mingling with the distant whir of lawn mowers, a symphony of suburban tranquility that masked the simmering tensions beneath the surface. Dr. Elena Marlo, Austin's first black police chief, sat on the edge of a lounge chair, her feet dipped into the cool water, her grandmother's civil rights movement pin glinting against the navy blue of her blouse. She had come here to decompress, to escape the relentless weight of her responsibilities just for an hour. But peace was fleeting. Elena closed her eyes briefly, savoring the momentary quiet. Her phone buzzed in her tote bag nearby, but she ignored it. For once, she didn't want to be Chief Marlo, the woman who brokered uneasy truces between protesters and officers, who navigated the minefield of reform within an institution resistant to change. Today, she simply wanted to exist without armor. Yet even as she tried to let go, the scars of her past lingered. Memories of Marcus, her brother, whose life had been cut short during a routine traffic stop, flashed unbidden through her mind. His absence loomed large, a ghostly presence shadowing every step forward she took. Her reverie shattered when heavy footsteps approached, loud enough to disrupt the tranquil rhythm of cicadas and splashing water. Carter Whitaker strode toward her with the deliberate confidence of someone who believed he owned not only the ground beneath his feet but also the very air around him. A white man in his 50s, dressed in khaki shorts and a polo shirt stretched taut across his broad frame, he stopped a few feet away, his hands planted firmly on his hips. His voice sliced through the stillness like a blade. "Ma'am," he began, his tone sharp enough to cut glass. "This is a private community. I'm going to need to see some ID." Elena opened her eyes slowly, her dark gaze meeting his. She recognized the type immediately, men like him, their faces flushed with indignation, their entitlement cloaked in civility. They were familiar from years of navigating rooms where she was the only black person, or neighborhoods where stares followed her every move. Men who assumed they could demand answers and expect compliance because of the color of their skin. She said nothing at first, letting the silence stretch between them. It unnerved him. She saw it in the way his jaw tightened and his fingers twitched against his sides. He shifted uncomfortably, his bravado faltering under her steady gaze. "I asked for your ID," he pressed, his voice rising now, tinged with frustration. "You can't just waltz in here like you belong." "And why not?" Elena finally replied, her voice calm but edged with steel. There was no trace of fear in her tone, though her pulse quickened imperceptibly. Years of training taught her to mask her reactions, to keep her emotions locked away until they could serve a purpose. Still, something about this confrontation stirred a primal unease deep within her, an old, inherited dread she thought she'd outgrown. Carter straightened, puffing out his chest as if trying to compensate for whatever authority he felt slipping away. "Because I know everyone who lives here," he shot back, his words dripping with condescension. "And you're not one of them." Elena tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "Is that so? Interesting." She paused, allowing the weight of his presumption to settle. Then, almost casually, she added, "Funny thing about assumptions, they have a way of biting back." Her composure infuriated him. Carter took a step closer, his shadow looming over her. Look, lady, I don't care who you think you are. You're trespassing. If you don't show me proof you live here, I'm calling security. A murmur rippled through the crowd of neighbors gathered nearby. Some watched with mild curiosity, others studiously avoided eye contact, their phones already raised to capture the scene unfolding before them. Elena's heart thudded in her chest, though her face remained impassive. She had disarmed bombs in her career, negotiated with armed suspects, and faced down riots. Yet here, in this moment, something primal stirred within her, a fear that felt older than herself, rooted in generations of exclusion and erasure. Still, she did not move. Instead, she leaned back slightly, her fingers brushing the badge clipped inside her bag. It remained untouched. She refused to pull rank, knowing instinctively that doing so would undermine the larger point she intended to make. What are you waiting for? Carter demanded, his voice escalating. Prove it. Prove you belong. Elena smiled faintly, a gesture devoid of warmth. Belonging isn't something you prove, Mr. Whitaker, she said softly. It's something you earn, or take away. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The cicadas resumed their chorus, filling the void left by his retreating words. Around them, cameras clicked silently, capturing every second of the confrontation. And somewhere deep inside, Elena felt the first tremors of what would become a seismic shift, not just for her, but for the entire city. As the tension reached its peak, Elena stood slowly, deliberately reclaiming her physical space. Her movements were measured, each step calculated to assert control without appearing confrontational. She turned to face Carter fully, her posture relaxed yet commanding. Tell me, Mr. Whitaker, she said, her voice carrying just enough volume to ensure the surrounding crowd could hear. Do you always greet your neighbors this way? Or am I special? Her question caught him off guard, and for a split second, uncertainty flickered across his face. But then his features hardened again, defiance replacing doubt. I'm serious, he growled. Show me your ID or leave. Elena sighed lightly, feigning exasperation. Fine, she said, reaching into her tote bag. But instead of pulling out identification, she produced a neatly folded document. Holding it up without standing, she let Carter see the heading, HOA Violations Report. Seems there's been quite a bit of activity about unauthorized landscaping modifications at 1423 Willow Creek Drive. That wouldn't happen to be your address, would it? The color drained from Carter's face. For the first time, doubt crept into his expression. Where did you get that? He demanded, his voice cracking slightly. That's irrelevant, Elena replied smoothly, tucking the paper back into her bag. What matters is that rules apply to everyone equally, or at least they're supposed to. Isn't that right, Mr. Whitaker? He opened his mouth to argue, but the words caught in his throat. Around them, the neighbors filming began whispering among themselves, their earlier detachment giving way to unease. One woman audibly gasped when she recognized Carter's address mentioned in Elena's report. Who do you think you are? Carter growled, his voice shaking now, not with rage, but with something else. Fear. Elena rose slowly, her movements deliberate, reclaiming her physical space. She stood just inches taller than him, though her presence loomed far larger. You asked me to prove who I am, she said, her tone icy yet controlled. But maybe the real question is, who are you, Carter? Are you the gatekeeper of this neighborhood? Or just another man hiding behind privilege because it's easier than facing accountability? His fists clenched at his sides, but he didn't respond. Instead, he glanced around wildly, searching for allies who might validate his position. But the crowd had turned lukewarm, their phones still recording but their expressions unreadable. Even Margaret Cole, the HOA president, lingered near the periphery, arms crossed, watching silently. You don't scare me, Carter muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. No? Elena replied, her lips curling into a faint smile. Then why does it feel like you're trembling? It was true. Carter's hands trembled visibly now, whether from fury or fear, it was impossible to tell. But one thing was clear, Elena had taken control of the narrative. Her refusal to engage on his terms, and her ability to expose his hypocrisy, had shifted the power dynamic entirely. As she gathered her belongings and walked away, leaving him standing alone by the pool, the whispers grew louder. Someone called after her, "Wait. Don't go." But Elena didn't look back. She knew this moment wasn't hers to own, it belonged to those watching, recording, absorbing. And while Carter may have thought he held all the cards, Elena understood something deeper. True power doesn't shout, it whispers. By the time Elena reached her car, parked discreetly along the curb outside the gates of Willow Creek Estates, she allowed herself a single exhale, a release of the tension she'd carried throughout the encounter. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, knuckles whitening as she processed what had just transpired. Though outwardly composed, inwardly, she wrestled with conflicting emotions, pride in how she handled the situation, anger at the audacity of Carter's behavior, and a gnawing sense of vulnerability that reminded her how precarious belonging could feel, even for someone in her position. As she drove home, the streets blurred together in streaks of orange and gold under the setting sun. The live oak tree in her backyard came into view, its sprawling branches reaching skyward like arms in prayer. Beneath it, she found solace, not only in its steadfast presence but also in the memories it held. It was here, years ago, that she had promised herself never to shrink in the face of injustice. Today, she had kept that promise. The confrontation at the pool had ended, but its aftershocks rippled outward like waves on a still pond. Carter Whitaker stood alone by the aquamarine water, his chest heaving as if he'd just run a marathon. His face was flushed red, not from exertion, but from a potent cocktail of humiliation and anger. Around him, the neighbors who had gathered to witness the spectacle began to disperse, their phones slipping back into pockets or purses. Some whispered among themselves, casting sidelong glances at Carter. Others avoided eye contact altogether, unwilling to acknowledge the awkwardness that lingered in the air. Elena's departure left a vacuum, a silence so heavy it pressed against Carter's ears. He clenched and unclenched his fists, trying to regain control of himself, but the tremor in his hands betrayed him. For all his bravado, for all the years he'd spent asserting dominance within Willow Creek Estates, he now felt exposed, diminished. And worse, he couldn't shake the feeling that Elena wasn't done with him yet. He turned sharply toward Margaret Cole, who lingered near the edge of the patio, arms crossed over her designer blouse. "Did you see what she did?" he snapped, his voice rising an octave higher than usual. "She thinks she can waltz in here, accuse me of violating HOA rules? Who does she even think she is?" Margaret raised an eyebrow, her expression coolly detached. "I saw everything," she replied evenly. "But yelling about it isn't going to help. If anything, it makes you look unhinged." Carter bristled at her tone. "Unhinged? Are you kidding me? She ambushed me. Exposed my personal information in front of everyone." He gestured wildly at the emptying pool area, though only a handful of stragglers remained. "This isn't over. I'll sue her for defamation." Margaret sighed, stepping closer until they were nearly toe-to-toe. Her polished demeanor cracked slightly, revealing the sharp pragmatism beneath. "Suing her will only draw more attention to this mess," she said, lowering her voice. "And trust me, we don't need any more videos going viral. The last thing we want is for people to start digging into our business." Her words landed like a slap. Carter opened his mouth to protest, but no sound came out. Instead, he glanced around furtively, suddenly aware of how many eyes might still be watching, how many phones might still be recording. His shoulders slumped slightly, the fight draining out of him. "Fine," he muttered after a long pause. "Then what do you suggest?" We just let her get away with this? Margaret smiled faintly, though there was no warmth in it. No one said, getting away with it. But retaliation isn't always loud. Sometimes, the best response is quiet and strategic. She reached into her bag and pulled out her phone, scrolling through contacts with practiced precision. Leave this to me. I'll handle it. Meanwhile, miles away in her modest home nestled in East Austin, Elena sat beneath the sprawling branches of the live oak tree in her backyard. The cicadas buzzed lazily overhead, their rhythmic hum blending with the distant hum of traffic. In her lap rested the same HOA violations report she'd wielded earlier, its pages now slightly crumpled from being handled too often. She stared at it absently, her mind replaying the events of the day. You played him perfectly, came a voice from behind her. Startled, Elena turned to see her childhood friend and confidant, Jamal Washington, leaning casually against the fence that bordered the property. Tall and broad-shouldered, with kind eyes that belied his sharp wit, Jamal had been a constant presence in Elena's life since grade school. Now a community organizer fighting against gentrification, he shared her passion for justice, and her skepticism of systems designed to exclude. I didn't play him, Elena corrected gently, though a hint of pride crept into her voice. I simply held up a mirror. Let him see himself for who he really is. Jamal chuckled, shaking his head as he joined her under the tree. Semantics. Either way, you shut him down without breaking a sweat. Wish I could have seen his face when you dropped that HOA report on him. Elena smirked, folding the document neatly and tucking it back into her bag. It was satisfying, she admitted. But temporary. You know as well as I do that moments like these don't change much. They expose cracks, sure, but unless we address the foundation, nothing shifts. Jamal nodded solemnly, his humor giving way to gravity. True. Still, exposing those cracks matters. People are talking about this already. Social media's blowing up. Folks are calling her the woman who schooled Carter Whitaker. He grinned briefly before sobering again. But what happens next? Because you know this isn't over. Elena leaned back against the tree trunk, closing her eyes briefly. When she spoke, her voice carried a weight that reflected years of grappling with impossible choices. I don't know yet. Part of me wants to press charges, to make an example of him. Show the world that men like Carter can't act with impunity anymore. But another part, she trailed off, opening her eyes to meet Jamal's steady gaze. Another part knows that pressing charges would only feed the narrative they want. That it would turn this into a spectacle instead of a reckoning. Jamal studied her carefully, recognizing the internal struggle etched across her features. So what's your plan? Elena exhaled slowly, running a hand through her hair. I'm going to wait. See how they respond. If Carter tries to retaliate publicly, or if someone else steps in to protect him, we'll have our opening. Until then, she paused, a flicker of resolve hardening her expression. Until then, I keep showing up. Keep reminding people that power isn't about shouting, it's about who gets to whisper. Back at Willow Creek Estates, Carter paced furiously along the perimeter of the pool, muttering curses under his breath. Margaret watched him from a distance, her lips curling into a faint smirk. She knew men like Carter, blustering, self-assured, convinced of their own infallibility. They were predictable, easy to manipulate once you understood their weaknesses. And right now, Carter's greatest weakness was fear, fear of exposure, fear of losing control, fear of being seen as less than invincible. When her phone buzzed with an incoming call, Margaret answered immediately, stepping away from the crowd to ensure privacy. Yes, she said crisply. What did you find? On the other end of the line, her assistant relayed the results of a hurried background check on Dr. Elena Marlo. Margaret listened intently, jotting down notes on a legal pad. By the time the call ended, her smirk had widened into something resembling satisfaction. Well, well, she murmured to herself, tapping the pen thoughtfully against her chin. Looks like our good doctor has skeletons of her own. That evening, as twilight descended over Austin, Elena returned to police headquarters to brief her team on the incident. The room buzzed with energy, officers huddled around monitors, replaying clips of the confrontation while debating what action should be taken. Deputy Chief Ramirez stood near the front of the room, arms crossed, waiting for Elena to speak. "Chief," he began without preamble, his tone urgent. "We need to press charges. Assault, harassment, you name it. This guy crossed every line." Elena stopped mid-step, turning to face him. Her expression was calm, but her eyes betrayed a storm of conflicting emotions. "And then what?" she asked, her voice measured but firm. "We arrest him, slap him with charges, and watch as his lawyers twist this into some sob story about being misunderstood. No. That's not how we win." Ramirez frowned, clearly frustrated. "So what do you propose? Let him walk away scot-free after humiliating you in front of the entire city?" "It's not about humiliation," Elena replied, sinking into a chair. "It's about exposure. People are watching, not just us, but Carter too. They're seeing the cracks in his facade. Pressing charges would only give him a platform to play victim. Instead," she paused, leaning forward, "I want to meet with him privately. Face to face." The room fell silent. Ramirez stared at her, incredulous. "Are you serious? After everything he said to you?" "Yes," Elena said simply. "Because justice isn't served by vengeance. It's served by understanding, and dismantling, the systems that allow men like him to thrive." As she spoke, her gaze drifted momentarily to the window, where the city skyline shimmered faintly in the distance. Somewhere out there, Carter Whitaker was plotting his next move, unaware that the real battle had only just. The live oak tree in Elena's backyard stood tall and unyielding, its sprawling branches casting dappled shadows over the cracked earth below. It had been there long before she was born, a silent witness to decades of change in the historically black neighborhood where she grew up. Now, as developers circled like vultures, eager to demolish homes and replace them with sleek condos catering to tech workers, the tree became more than a relic, it was a symbol of resilience. Every morning, Elena would sit beneath its gnarled boughs, sipping coffee and reflecting on how far she'd come, and how much farther she still had to go. Her journey hadn't been linear. Raised by a single mother who worked double shifts at the hospital cafeteria, Elena learned early on the value of grit and determination. Her childhood home, modest but filled with love, sat mere blocks from where gentrification now threatened to erase everything familiar. When she was 12, her older brother Marcus was killed during a routine traffic stop, a tragedy that ignited both her outrage and her resolve. Years later, as a public defender fresh out of law school, she fought tirelessly against systemic inequities, challenging predatory lending practices and advocating for affordable housing initiatives. But fighting for justice came at a cost. The PTSD from Marcus's death haunted her, manifesting in panic attacks triggered by moments of conflict or confrontation. During her tenure as a reform-minded police chief, these episodes forced her to confront uncomfortable truths about herself. Was she complicit in perpetuating the same systems she sought to dismantle? Could she truly effect change from within an institution steeped in brutality and bias? These questions weighed heavily on her, especially as she navigated the delicate balance between idealism and pragmatism. Flashing back to one pivotal protest in 2019, Elena remembered standing shoulder to shoulder with community members demanding accountability after another fatal police shooting. She had joined their chants, her voice hoarse from shouting, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and exhilaration. At the time, she believed the system could be reformed from within, that wearing the badge gave her the leverage needed to enact meaningful change. But as years passed and progress proved agonizingly slow, doubts crept in. Now, sitting beneath the live oak, memories collided with the present. She thought of Carter Whitaker's sneering face, the way his accusations echoed centuries of exclusionary practices. She thought of Margaret Cole, whose philanthropy masked opportunism, and the countless others who profited from displacement while claiming moral high ground. Most of all, she thought of her grandmother's civil rights pin, pinned proudly to her blouse each day, a reminder of sacrifices made and battles won. As the cicadas buzzed overhead and sunlight filtered through the leaves, Elena whispered to herself, "Resilience isn't inherited, it's cultivated." The tree swayed gently, as if nodding in agreement. Elena's phone buzzed again, breaking the spell of quiet reflection. This time, she glanced at the screen. "Jamal." With a sigh, she answered, bracing herself for whatever news he might deliver. "Hey," she said, her tone weary but warm. "You need to see this," Jamal replied without preamble, his voice tight with urgency. "It's about Carter." Elena straightened, her pulse quickening. "What is it?" "He's lawyering up, and not just any lawyer. Word is, Margaret Cole pulled strings to get him representation from some high-powered firm downtown. They're already spinning this whole thing as a misunderstanding. Saying you provoked him." Elena clenched her jaw, frustration bubbling beneath her calm exterior. "Of course they are," she muttered. "They always do." "There's more," Jamal continued, his voice dropping lower. "Margaret's people have been digging into your past. They're trying to find dirt, anything they can use to discredit you. So far, they've got nothing substantial, but they're not going to stop until they twist something against you." Elena closed her eyes briefly, letting the weight of his words settle. She knew this playbook all too well: deflect, distract, destroy. It was a strategy as old as power itself, wielded by those desperate to maintain control. Yet knowing it didn't make it any less exhausting, or dangerous. "Thanks for the heads up," she said finally, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. "I'll handle it." Jamal hesitated, then added softly, "You don't have to do this alone, Elena. Remember that." She smiled faintly, though he couldn't see it. "I know. But right now, I need to think." After hanging up, Elena returned her attention to the live oak, tracing its ridged bark with her fingertips. The tree had survived storms, droughts, and even attempts to cut it down when developers first eyed the land decades ago. Its roots ran deep, intertwining with the history of the neighborhood, the stories of joy and struggle etched into every crack in the sidewalk, every faded mural on the walls of nearby buildings. Her mind drifted to her mother, who had taught her the importance of planting seeds, not just in soil, but in people. "Change takes time," her mother used to say. "But it starts small. One conversation, one act of kindness, one refusal to stay silent." Elena had carried those lessons with her throughout her life, using them as guiding principles in her work. Yet here, beneath the tree, she found herself questioning whether those principles were enough. Could kindness compete with greed? Could conversations dismantle systems built on exploitation? Later that evening, Elena attended a meeting of East Austin Rising, a grassroots organization dedicated to preserving affordable housing and resisting gentrification. The gathering took place in a cramped community center, its walls adorned with posters decrying displacement and celebrating cultural heritage. Dozens of residents packed the room, their faces reflecting a mix of determination and exhaustion. When it was her turn to speak, Elena stepped to the front, her presence commanding yet humble. "I want to thank you all for being here tonight," she began, her voice resonating clearly despite the lack of amplification. "For fighting, not just for yourselves, but for future generations. Because what we're doing isn't just about keeping roofs over our heads. It's about reclaiming our right to belong." Applause rippled through the crowd, followed by murmurs of agreement. But Elena held up a hand, silencing them. "That said, I need to be honest with you. The fight ahead won't be easy. People like Carter Whitaker, and Margaret Cole, will stop at nothing to protect their interests. They'll try to divide us, to paint us as unreasonable or radical. And they'll use fear to keep us quiet. She paused, scanning the room, making eye contact with as many people as possible. But we can't let them. Fear is their weapon, but resilience is ours. We've survived worse than this. Together, we've faced down forces bigger than ourselves, and we've prevailed. That's why I'm asking you to stand with me, not just today, but tomorrow, and the day after that. Because real change doesn't happen overnight. It happens step by step, brick by brick. Her words ignited a spark in the room, reigniting the fire that had brought everyone together. As the meeting concluded, several attendees approached her, offering support and sharing personal stories of loss and resistance. Among them was Maria Alvarez, a longtime resident whose family had lived in the neighborhood for 3 generations. They tried to buy my house last year, Maria confided, her voice trembling with emotion. Offered me twice what it's worth. But I told them no. My abuela raised 8 kids in that house. It's sacred ground. Elena placed a reassuring hand on Maria's shoulder. Your courage inspires me, she said sincerely. And it reminds me why we can't give up. Not now. Not ever. That night, as Elena drove home under a canopy of stars, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead would be fraught with challenges, yes, but she wasn't walking it alone. Around her, a network of allies was growing stronger, united by a shared vision of justice and belonging. Beneath the surface, roots intertwined, anchoring themselves against the winds of change. Yet even as hope buoyed her spirit, a nagging question lingered in the back of her mind. How far was too far? How much could one person sacrifice before the cost outweighed the cause? For now, though, she pushed the doubt aside, focusing instead on the task at hand. Tomorrow would bring new battles, and perhaps, new opportunities to plant seeds of change. As she pulled into her driveway, the live oak loomed large against the night sky, its silhouette a testament to endurance. Elena climbed out of her car and approached it, resting her palm against its rough bark. We're still standing, she whispered, almost to herself. And we're not done yet. By the next morning, the video of Elena's encounter with Carter Whitaker had gone viral. Social media timelines were ablaze with hashtags like #WhitakerGate and #ElenaStandsFirm, while news outlets scrambled to cover what many were calling a modern-day echo of the McKinney Pool incident. Clips of Carter's red-faced demands and Elena's steely retorts played on repeat, accompanied by captions labeling her as the calm embodiment of resistance and him as a walking caricature of white privilege. The confrontation had become more than just a local story. It was a national conversation about race, power, and accountability. At police headquarters, however, the atmosphere was anything but celebratory. Officers huddled around monitors in the break room, some cheering quietly while others exchanged grim looks. Deputy Chief Ramirez found Elena in her office, pacing slowly, her brow furrowed in thought. He knocked lightly on the doorframe before stepping inside. "Chief," he began without preamble, his tone urgent. "We need to press charges. Assault, harassment, you name it. This guy crossed every line." Elena stopped mid-step, turning to face him. Her expression remained calm, but there was a flicker of something deeper, resignation, perhaps, or exhaustion, behind her eyes. "And then what?" she asked, her voice measured but firm. "We arrest him, slap him with charges, and watch as his lawyers twist this into some sob story about being misunderstood. No. That's not how we win." Ramirez frowned, clearly frustrated. "So what do you propose? Let him walk away scot-free after humiliating you in front of the entire city?" "It's not about humiliation," Elena replied, sinking into her chair. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on her desk. "It's about exposure. People are watching, not just us, but Carter too. They're seeing the cracks in his facade. Pressing charges would only give him a platform to play victim. Instead, she paused, choosing her words carefully. I want to meet with him privately. Face to face. The room fell silent. Ramirez stared at her, incredulous. Are you serious? After everything he said to you? Yes, Elena said simply. Because justice isn't served by vengeance. It's served by understanding, and dismantling, the systems that allow men like him to thrive. Meanwhile, across town, Margaret Cole convened an emergency meeting of the HOA board. Seated at the head of a mahogany table in her opulent study, she clasped her hands together, her expression tight with barely concealed anxiety. The morning's headlines blared from multiple screens mounted on the walls, each one amplifying the growing backlash against Carter Whitaker, and, by extension, the gated community he represented. This situation has spiraled out of control, Margaret declared, addressing the group. Her voice carried a sharp edge, cutting through the murmurs of concern rippling through the room. If Carter doesn't handle this properly, it could jeopardize our relationships with key donors, and my husband's real estate projects. One board member cleared his throat nervously. What exactly are you suggesting, Margaret? She leaned back, exhaling sharply. We offer her a settlement. Quietly. Hush money. Enough to ensure she keeps this quiet and lets Carter off the hook publicly. But she's the police chief, another member interjected. Do you really think she'll accept bribery? Margaret smirked coldly. Not bribery. An incentive. Frame it as reparations for any distress caused. Trust me, people like her always have a price. Her confidence seemed unshakable, but beneath the polished exterior, doubt gnawed at her. She knew Elena Marlo wasn't like the others. They'd underestimated her once already, and it had cost them dearly. Still, Margaret refused to entertain the possibility that their usual tactics might fail. Control was her currency, and she wasn't about to let anyone take it from her. Unbeknownst to both Elena and Margaret, the fallout from the viral video was spreading far beyond Austin. Activists nationwide seized on the moment, using it to highlight ongoing struggles against systemic racism and exclusionary practices. Protests erupted outside similar gated communities across the country, with demonstrators chanting slogans like, "Safety is a right, not a privilege," and holding signs that read, "Accountability over authority." In classrooms, living rooms, and workplaces, conversations ignited about who gets to decide who belongs, and at what cost. For Elena, the sudden spotlight brought both validation and vulnerability. Messages poured in from strangers praising her composure and courage, but also from critics questioning whether she should have pressed charges immediately. Even within her own department, opinions were divided. Some officers admired her restraint, others accused her of letting personal pride overshadow professional duty. That evening, as she sat alone in her office, Elena scrolled through the flood of notifications on her phone. Among them was a direct message from Jamal. You've started something big. Be ready. She set the phone down and gazed out the window at the city skyline, now illuminated by the golden glow of sunset. The weight of responsibility pressed heavily on her shoulders, but so did the promise of possibility. For years, she'd worked tirelessly to reform a system resistant to change. Now, the world was watching, and waiting, to see what she would do next. Later that night, Elena made her decision. Sitting at her desk, she drafted a statement to be released alongside the full, unedited footage of the confrontation. Unlike the clips circulating online, this version captured the raw emotion of the moment, the tension in Carter's voice, the defiant calm in hers, and the uncomfortable silence of the bystanders who chose not to intervene. At the end of the video, she added a simple caption, "Real justice doesn't wear a badge." When the footage went live, the response was immediate and overwhelming. Supporters hailed her transparency, calling it a bold move to reclaim the narrative from those who sought to distort it. Critics accused her of grandstanding, arguing that releasing the video only fueled division rather than fostering dialogue. But Elena knew better. Transparency wasn't about seeking approval, it was about exposing truth. As dawn broke over Austin, protesters gathered outside City Hall, chanting her name and demanding accountability. Reporters camped out on the steps, microphones poised, eager to hear her next move. Inside her office, Elena watched the scene unfold on television, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and exhilaration. She had spent years navigating the gray areas between idealism and pragmatism, compromise and conviction. Now, standing on the precipice of something greater, she realized there was no turning back. Her phone buzzed again, a call from the mayor's office. When she answered, the voice on the other end was clipped and formal. "Dr. Marlo, the city council wants to meet with you urgently. There are concerns about your actions." Elena smiled faintly, though the caller couldn't see it. "Tell them I'll be there," she said evenly. "But make no mistake, I'm not going anywhere." Across town, Carter Whitaker sat slumped in a leather armchair, nursing a glass of bourbon as Margaret paced the floor of his home office. The fallout from the video had been swift and brutal. His reputation was in tatters, his attempts at damage control mocked relentlessly on social media. Worst of all, the whispers among neighbors had turned into outright hostility. "You underestimated her," Margaret said finally, stopping mid-pace to glare at him. "You treated her like just another nuisance instead of realizing she's a force to be reckoned with." Carter slammed his glass onto the side table, spilling liquor across the polished surface. "What was I supposed to do? Let her insult me in front of everyone? You told me to stand my ground. And look where that got you," Margaret shot back, her patience wearing thin. "Now we're dealing with a PR nightmare because of your ego." Before Carter could respond, the doorbell rang. Margaret glanced at him pointedly. "That'll be the lawyer. Try not to embarrass yourself further." As she left the room, Carter sank deeper into his chair, staring blankly at the wall. For the first time in his life, he felt powerless, and hated every second of it. Back at police headquarters, Elena prepared for the meeting with the city council, knowing full well that the battle ahead would test her resolve like never before. Yet even as doubts lingered at the edges of her mind, she clung to the belief that true justice required sacrifice. And if planting seeds of change meant uprooting herself from the very institution she'd sworn to serve, then so be it. As she walked out of her office, pinning her grandmother's civil rights movement badge to her lapel, she whispered softly to herself, "This is just the beginning." The release of the unedited footage sent shockwaves through Austin, igniting protests that spilled onto the steps of the Texas Capitol. Protesters chanted slogans like, "Safety is a right, not a privilege," and carried signs reading, "Accountability over authority." Among them stood Elena, no longer in uniform but clad in a crisp white blazer adorned with her grandmother's civil rights pin. Her presence electrified the crowd, transforming what could have been a fleeting moment of outrage into a sustained movement for systemic change. In response, Carter issued a hastily written apology, delivered via a PR firm and broadcast on local news. "I didn't know she was the chief," he stammered, his tone rehearsed and devoid of sincerity. "If I had known, things would have been different." The statement sparked widespread ridicule, with critics pointing out the absurdity of conditional respect. Memes flooded social media, captioned with phrases like, "Oops, my racism only works on regular people," and "conditional humanity, a how-to guide." But Elena's next move silenced the mockery, and shocked even her closest allies. Standing before reporters outside City Hall, she announced her resignation as police chief, effective immediately. "For too long, I've tried to reform a system built on oppression," she declared, her voice steady despite the weight of her words. "But true justice requires more than reform, it demands transformation. That's why I'm running for mayor." The declaration sent ripples through the political landscape. Supporters rallied behind her campaign slogan, emblazoned on banners and t-shirts, "Safety isn't a privilege, it's a right." Critics dismissed her bid as naive, arguing that electoral politics couldn't dismantle entrenched inequities. Yet Elena pressed forward undeterred, drawing strength from grassroots organizers and community leaders who had long fought for equitable housing, education, and policing policies. Behind closed doors, however, tensions simmered. At a glitzy fundraiser hosted by Margaret Cole, Carter smirked as he accepted pats on the back from fellow HOA members. "She's playing right into our hands," he said, swirling a glass of bourbon. "Let her waste her time chasing votes while we keep building walls higher." Margaret nodded approvingly, though her smile didn't reach her eyes. "Just make sure your legal team stays ready," she advised. "We may need them again sooner than you think." As the evening wore on, Carter's laughter echoed through the marble halls, a stark contrast to the quiet determination radiating from Elena's campaign headquarters miles away. Elena's decision to resign as police chief wasn't made lightly. It came after sleepless nights spent weighing the costs of staying within an institution she believed could never truly be reformed. She remembered Marcus's face, the way his laughter used to light up a room, and wondered if wearing the badge had only perpetuated the cycle of violence that stole him from her. These reflections haunted her, pushing her toward a path less traveled but no less necessary. Her announcement drew immediate attention, not just locally but nationally. News outlets framed her candidacy as both groundbreaking and audacious. Pundits debated whether a former police chief could credibly run on a platform advocating for police reform and community-led safety initiatives. Meanwhile, grassroots supporters celebrated her boldness, seeing it as a rejection of performative authority in favor of genuine accountability. Jamal Washington became one of her earliest and most vocal advocates. He worked tirelessly alongside her, organizing town halls, canvassing neighborhoods, and mobilizing volunteers. Together, they crafted a vision for Austin rooted in inclusion and equity, a vision that challenged the myth of progress without substance. "We can't keep pretending that shiny new buildings and tech jobs solve decades of inequality," Jamal told a packed auditorium during one such event. "Real progress means investing in people, not profits. And that starts with leadership willing to listen, not just talk." Elena stood beside him, nodding in agreement. When it was her turn to speak, she stepped forward, her voice carrying the same quiet power that had disarmed Carter Whitaker weeks earlier. "This isn't about me," she began. "It's about us. About reclaiming our city from those who see it as a playground for the privileged and returning it to the communities who built it. Safety isn't something you earn, it's something you deserve. And together, we're going to prove that." The crowd erupted in cheers, their energy palpable. For the first time in years, many residents felt heard, not as statistics or headlines, but as human beings worthy of dignity and respect. Across town, Margaret Cole watched Elena's speech unfold on television, her expression unreadable. Beside her, Carter sipped another glass of bourbon, his smirk fading slightly under the weight of public scrutiny. "She's making this personal," Margaret murmured, tapping her nails against the armrest of her chair. "Turning herself into a symbol." Carter shrugged, feigning indifference. "So what? Symbols are easy to tear down." "Not when they're backed by action," Margaret countered sharply. "People are rallying around her because she represents something bigger than herself. If we don't act soon, she'll take everything we've worked for." Her words hung heavy in the air between them. Carter set his glass down, suddenly sober. "Then what do you suggest?" Margaret leaned back, her mind racing. "We hit her where it hurts. Expose her vulnerabilities. Make her look like just another politician chasing power." "And how exactly do we do that?" Carter asked skeptically. Margaret smiled thinly. "Leave that to me." Days later, whispers began circulating online, anonymous posts accusing Elena of hypocrisy, citing alleged inconsistencies in her past statements about policing. While none of the claims held water, they planted seeds of doubt among undecided voters. Simultaneously, attacks on her character intensified, with opponents painting her as radical and divisive. Despite the backlash, Elena remained steadfast. She addressed the allegations head-on during a televised debate, her composure unwavering. "Anyone who knows me knows my record speaks for itself," she said, locking eyes with the moderator. "I've spent my life fighting for justice, not because it's easy, but because it's right. If standing up for what I believe in makes me divisive, then so be it." The audience erupted in applause, silencing her detractors momentarily. But Elena knew better than to let her guard down. Every victory came at a cost, and the road ahead promised to be fraught with challenges. One evening, as she prepared for yet another campaign stop, Jamal joined her in her makeshift headquarters, a converted garage filled with folding chairs and mismatched tables covered in campaign materials. He handed her a cup of coffee, his expression unusually somber. "You okay?" he asked gently. Elena hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah. Just tired." Jamal studied her for a moment before speaking. "You don't have to do this alone, Elena. Remember that. We're all here for you." She smiled faintly, touched by his concern. "I know. And I couldn't do any of this without you, or everyone else who's shown up. But sometimes," she trailed off, staring into her coffee. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm asking too much of people. Of myself." Jamal placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Change doesn't come without sacrifice. You taught me that. And yeah, maybe it feels like too much right now. But trust me, when we win, it'll be worth it." Elena looked up, meeting his gaze. In that moment, she found renewed resolve. The fight wasn't just hers, it belonged to everyone who refused to stay silent. Together, they were planting seeds of hope in soil long thought barren. And though storms loomed on the horizon, she knew that resilience ran deep as the roots of the live oak tree in her backyard. That night, as she drove home beneath a canopy of stars, Elena replayed the day's events in her mind. Each protest chant, each supportive message, each skeptical question, they all reminded her of the stakes. Winning wasn't just about defeating Carter or Margaret, it was about proving that systems built on exclusion could be dismantled and rebuilt with compassion and integrity. When she arrived home, she walked straight to the live oak tree, its silhouette illuminated by moonlight. Resting her palm against its bark, she whispered softly, "We're still standing. And we're not done yet." Above her, the branches swayed gently, whispering back in the language of resilience. On a crisp autumn morning, months after the viral confrontation at Willow Creek Estates, the community gathered for a ceremony to rename the pool in Elena's honor. A brass plaque bearing her name gleamed under the sunlight, flanked by bouquets of wildflowers and chalk drawings of oak trees sketched by children. Speeches praised her courage and leadership, painting her as a beacon of hope in a city grappling with its contradictions. Yet beneath the surface, unresolved tensions lingered, stubborn as roots pushing through concrete. At the edge of the crowd, Carter Whitaker watched silently, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. Though he avoided direct eye contact with Elena, his smirk betrayed a lingering defiance. Nearby, Margaret Cole mingled with other HOA members, her polished demeanor masking the machinations still underway. Their presence cast a shadow over the celebration, a reminder that systemic rot often thrives unseen, feeding on complacency and privilege. As the event drew to a close, Elena stood beneath the live oak in her yard, tracing its ridged bark with her fingertips. The postscript to her story emerged quietly yet resolutely. Can a community built on exclusion ever learn to belong to everyone? It was a question without an easy answer, one that echoed in the rustle of leaves and the distant hum of construction cranes reshaping the skyline. For now, the renamed pool stood as a symbol of progress, but also as a challenge. Could Austin rise above its divisions, or would it remain trapped in cycles of erasure and resistance? Only time would tell. The renaming ceremony had been organized as both a tribute and a statement, a public acknowledgement of the work Elena had done to expose inequities while challenging the city to do better. Families from across East Austin joined politicians, activists, and journalists in celebrating what many called a turning point for the community. Children splashed in the water, their laughter ringing out like a hymn of renewal. Yet even amid the festivities, cracks showed. Some neighbors whispered about how political correctness had gone too far, while others openly questioned whether renaming a pool could truly address deeper issues of segregation and inequality. For every person who cheered Elena's name, there was another who muttered dismissively, "It's just a pool." Elena noticed these undercurrents but chose not to dwell on them. Instead, she focused on the faces of those who mattered most, the residents who had fought alongside her, the families whose lives had been upended by displacement, the young activists brimming with ideas for change. As she accepted a bouquet of flowers from a little girl, her gaze softened. These were the people who gave meaning to her fight. Still, as the day wore on, Elena couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was missing. She scanned the crowd, searching for familiar figures among the sea of strangers. Jamal was there, of course, along with Maria Alvarez and several key organizers from East Austin Rising. But where was Marcus? She closed her eyes briefly, imagining him standing beside her, his broad smile lighting up the space around him. He would have teased her mercilessly about becoming a political figurehead, then reminded her why she deserved every bit of recognition she received. "You've always been fearless," he'd say. "Now you're teaching others how to be brave, too." When she opened her eyes again, tears glistened faintly in the corners. She wiped them away quickly, unwilling to let anyone see her vulnerability. Not here, not today. This moment wasn't hers alone. It belonged to everyone who refused to stay silent. Later that afternoon, as the crowd dispersed and the sun dipped toward the horizon, Elena found herself alone by the pool. The brass plaque reflected the golden light, its inscription simple yet powerful: Dr. Elena Marlo Pool, dedicated to justice, belonging, and resilience. She knelt beside it, running her fingers over the engraved letters. Her grandmother's pin caught the light, glinting against her blouse like a tiny beacon. In that moment, she felt the weight of history pressing down on her, the sacrifices made by those who came before her, the battles fought and won, the losses endured. And yet, she also felt the pull of possibility, the promise of futures yet unwritten. Behind her, footsteps approached. She turned to see Jamal, his expression unusually serious. "You okay?" he asked softly. Elena nodded, rising to her feet. "Yeah. Just thinking about Marcus?" She hesitated, then smiled faintly. "About everything. About whether this is enough." Jamal stepped closer, placing a hand on her shoulder. "It's never going to feel like enough. Not when the work is never done. But look around you, Elena. Look at what you've already achieved. You've given people hope, and that's more than most can say." His words settled over her like a balm, easing some of the tension coiled inside. Still, doubts lingered. Hope was fragile, easily shattered by fear or greed. What happened next depended on whether others chose to nurture it, or let it wither. Across town, Carter Whitaker nursed another glass of bourbon in his dimly lit study. The fundraiser hosted by Margaret Cole had done little to repair his damaged reputation, and whispers of scandal continued to dog him. His once unshakable confidence had eroded into bitterness, leaving behind a man desperate to reclaim control. Margaret sat across from him, reviewing legal documents spread across the coffee table. "We need to focus on damage control," she said firmly. "Public perception is shifting faster than we anticipated. If we don't act soon, we risk losing everything." Carter scowled, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "And what exactly do you propose? More apologies? Another PR campaign?" Margaret leaned back, her lips curling into a cold smile. "No. Something bigger. We strike preemptively, expose her weaknesses before she solidifies her base. Make her look like just another politician chasing power." He raised an eyebrow, intrigued despite himself. Go on. Her voice dropped lower, conspiratorial. Rumors are spreading about her ties to radical groups. We fan those flames, make voters question her motives. And if that doesn't work? She paused, letting the implication hang in the air. We escalate. Carter drained his glass, setting it down with a thud. Fine. Do whatever it takes. I'm done playing nice. Margaret nodded approvingly, though her smile didn't reach her eyes. Good. Because this isn't just about you anymore. It's about preserving the system that keeps us all in power. That night, as Elena returned home, she passed the live oak tree one last time. Its branches swayed gently in the cool breeze, casting long shadows across the cracked earth below. She paused, resting her palm against its rough bark. We've come a long way, she whispered, almost to herself. But the road ahead is still steep. Above her, the stars shimmered faintly, their light piercing through the darkness. Somewhere in the distance, cicadas buzzed lazily, their song a reminder of endurance. The world was changing, slowly but surely, and Elena knew she wouldn't stop fighting until it changed for good. As she walked inside, closing the door behind her, the final question lingered unanswered. Can a community built on exclusion ever learn to belong to everyone? Only time would tell.